The Harvard lecture hall fell silent when 12-year-old Elijah Carter raised his hand. "There's a symmetry error in the third line," he said, pointing to the theorem Dr. Whitmore had just declared unsolvable. The professor's smirk vanished as he checked the formula and realized the boy in hand-me-downs was right. What Elijah didn't know, his mathematical insight wouldn't just correct an equation. It would expose a Cold War secret his grandfather had buried decades ago. As video of the moment went viral, powerful institutions scrambled to control a discovery that could revolutionize encryption forever. They never expected their greatest threat would be a child who simply saw patterns that everyone else had missed. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. And if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Elijah Carter shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the shuttle approached the towering brick buildings of Harvard University. The 12-year-old boy tugged at the collar of his faded blue button-up shirt, a hand-me-down that hung slightly loose on his slender frame. His dark eyes widened as he took in the ancient oaks and manicured lawns that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. "You doing okay, Elijah?" asked Ms. Jackson, his mentor from the STEM outreach program that had selected him for this special opportunity. Her voice was gentle, understanding the weight of the moment. Elijah nodded silently, but his fingers tightened around the worn leather notebook in his lap, a gift from his grandfather that never left his side. The shuttle came to a stop, and Elijah found himself staring up at the imposing architecture of the mathematics building where the symposium would be held. "Mom really couldn't come?" he asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. "She tried, Elijah. The hospital wouldn't give her the day off, even for this." Ms. Jackson placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "But she made me promise to take plenty of pictures." Elijah understood. His mother worked double shifts as a nurse to keep food on the table. Days off were luxuries they couldn't afford. He straightened his shoulders and followed Ms. Jackson toward the entrance, where students in expensive clothes lounged casually, as if the grandeur around them was nothing special. Inside, the lecture hall buzzed with anticipation. Professors in tweed jackets mingled with eager graduate students and wealthy donors. Camera crews from academic publications set up in the corners. Elijah and Ms. Jackson found seats near the back, where Elijah felt less conspicuous amid the sea of unfamiliar faces. "That's him," whispered an excited student nearby, pointing toward the stage. "Dr. Jonathan Whitmore." A tall man with silver-streaked hair and an expensive watch strode confidently to the podium. The room fell silent immediately. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the dean, "we are honored to present Dr. Jonathan Whitmore, whose groundbreaking work in theoretical mathematics has reshaped our understanding of computational limits." Applause thundered through the hall. Elijah watched Dr. Whitmore's confident smile as he arranged his notes and adjusted the microphone. There was something cold in the professor's eyes that made Elijah shrink further into his chair. "Thank you for that warm welcome," Whitmore began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. "Today we're going to explore something beautiful and frustrating, a problem that has survived centuries of the brightest minds attempting to crack it." He turned to the massive whiteboard behind him and began writing with practiced precision. Numbers, symbols, and abstract expressions flowed from his marker in a dense tapestry of mathematics. Elijah leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracking each stroke. "This," Whitmore said dramatically as he finished writing, "is what we call the symmetrical integration theorem. First proposed in 1887, it has remained stubbornly unsolved." He paused, surveying the room. "Even our most sophisticated AI systems have made zero meaningful progress. The mathematical patterns simply don't resolve." Elijah's pencil moved quietly across his notebook, copying the expression with careful strokes. Ms. Jackson glanced over, impressed by his neat handwriting. "Now," Whitmore continued with a smirk, "I know we live in an age where social media tells us that every child with a calculator is the next Ramanujan, a time when Hollywood movies suggest that some undiscovered genius will scribble the answer to everything on a napkin." He chuckled, and many in the audience joined him. Reality is considerably more humbling. Elijah wasn't listening anymore. Something about the expression on the board had caught his attention. His pencil stopped copying and began making small notations in the margins. Tiny arrows connected different sections of the formula as he mumbled something inaudible to himself. "Did you say something?" Ms. Jackson whispered. Elijah shook his head, lost in concentration. On stage, Whitmore was now taking questions. A teenage boy from another youth program stood up confidently. "Dr. Whitmore, couldn't you approach this by treating the third variable as a constant and then—" Whitmore's smile tightened. "Ah, the YouTube approach," he interrupted. "No, young man, that would collapse the entire function. This isn't a high school problem set." He turned to the audience. "And this, ladies and gentlemen, is why real mathematics can't be taught through 5-minute videos." Laughter rippled through the crowd as the teen sank back into his seat, face burning with embarrassment. Elijah winced in sympathy, but his eyes never left his notebook. His pencil moved faster now, sketching abstract visualizations alongside the numbers, patterns that seemed to dance across the page. Ms. Jackson caught a glimpse of his work. The strange diagrams weren't anything she recognized from standard mathematics. "Elijah," she whispered, "where did you learn to do that?" He shrugged without looking up. "I just see it this way," he murmured, then added so quietly she barely heard him. "I think I know what's wrong with his formula." "What do, you mean?" she asked. But Elijah had already raised his hand tentatively into the air. At first, no one noticed. Whitmore was expounding on the theorem's applications in quantum computing when he paused, spotting the small hand raised in the back row. A few heads turned. Someone snickered. "Yes?" Whitmore called, his tone slightly condescending. "You have a question?" The room fell silent as Elijah stood up slowly. He was so small that he barely rose above the heads in front of him. "I think," Elijah said, his voice barely audible, "there's a symmetry error in the third line." More snickers, but Whitmore's face remained locked in a polite smile. "A symmetry error," he repeated. "And what might that be?" Elijah swallowed hard. "The function isn't balanced. When you transform the variables on both sides, they don't maintain equivalence because—" He hesitated, gathering courage. "Because you're treating it like a closed system when it's actually open-ended. The pattern continues beyond what you've written." The smile vanished from Whitmore's face. He turned to the board, scanning the third line of his equation. The room went completely still. For several long seconds, no one spoke. Then Whitmore cleared his throat. "Young man, what's your name?" "Elijah Carter, sir." Whitmore looked at the equation again, then back at Elijah with narrowed eyes. "And where exactly did you learn about open system equivalence in advanced calculus, Elijah Carter?" Before Elijah could answer, a phone camera flashed, then another. Someone whispered loudly, "Is he right?" A professor in the front row stood up and approached the board, examining the formula closely. Elijah stood frozen, suddenly aware of the attention focused on him. Ms. Jackson gently tugged at his sleeve, and he gratefully sank back into his chair. The professor at the board turned to Whitmore. "Jonathan," he said slowly, "I think the boy might be onto something. Look at the symmetrical distributions if we extend the pattern." A murmur swept through the crowd, growing louder as more people pulled out phones to record. Whitmore's face had drained of color. He stared at Elijah with an unreadable expression, surprise mingled with something darker. The dean hurried to the stage and whispered something in Whitmore's ear. The professor nodded stiffly and turned to the audience. "It seems we have an interesting observation to consider," he said tightly. "We'll take a 30-minute break to review this unexpected input." People surged from their seats, many heading straight for Elijah. Ms. Jackson protectively put an arm around his shoulders. "Elijah," she said quietly, "what just happened?" But Elijah was looking at his notebook, where the patterns he'd drawn seemed to pulse with potential. "I don't know," he answered honestly. "It just looked wrong, so I fixed it." As cameras continued to flash around them, the image that would soon circle the globe was captured. A small boy in too large clothes, holding a battered notebook containing insights that should have been impossible. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of the small hotel room where Elijah sat cross-legged on the bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. He stared blankly at the television where a news anchor gesticulated excitedly beside a frozen image of him standing in the Harvard lecture hall. Video has already received over 2 million views overnight, the anchor was saying. Harvard. Officials have declined to comment on whether the boy's observation was mathematically sound, but sources within the mathematics department confirmed that faculty held an emergency meeting until 3 a.m. Ms. Jackson switched off the TV. "Your mom called? She saw the news." Elijah nodded absently, his fingers tracing patterns on the bedspread. "Is she mad?" "Mad?" "Elijah, she's proud. Confused, but proud." She sat beside him. "Are you hungry? We should get breakfast before—" A knock at the door interrupted her. Dean Langford stood in the hallway, his gray suit impeccably pressed despite the early hour. "Mr. Carter," he said, smiling broadly at Elijah. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. May I come in?" Ms. Jackson nodded, and the dean entered, settling into the desk chair. "I'll be direct," he said. "We'd like to invite you to extend your stay at Harvard for 3 more days. With your guardian's permission, of course. We believe your insight yesterday warrants further exploration." "My mom can't take off work," Elijah said quietly. "Ms. Jackson would continue to accompany you as your chaperone, with all expenses covered by the university," the dean explained. "We've already called your mother. She was hesitant at first, but we've assured her of your safety." Ms. Jackson raised an eyebrow. "And Dr. Whitmore, how does he feel about this arrangement?" Something flickered across Dean Langford's face. "Dr. Whitmore understands the public relations value of this opportunity. He's agreed to cooperate." Translation. Whitmore was furious but had been overruled, Elijah thought. "What do you think, Elijah?" Ms. Jackson asked gently. "It's your choice." Elijah looked down at his notebook. The patterns were still there, still unfinished. Something pulled at him, a need to see where they led. "I'll stay," he said softly. 2 hours later, Elijah stood in the mathematics lab surrounded by whiteboards and computer terminals. Graduate students pretended not to stare as he cautiously approached one of the boards. "You may use any of the resources here," said the teaching assistant assigned to monitor him. "Just let me know if you need anything." Elijah nodded and picked up a marker. For several minutes, he simply stared at the blank whiteboard, gathering his thoughts. Then he began to write. Unlike Whitmore's precise, methodical approach, Elijah's work seemed almost artistic. He didn't start at the beginning of the theorem, but jumped directly to the section he'd identified as problematic. Around it, he sketched strange visual aids, curves and shapes that seemed to represent the mathematical relationships in ways standard notation couldn't capture. From the doorway, Professor Rima Shah watched with growing fascination. As director of the Applied Mathematics Division, she'd initially come to assess whether the boy's viral moment was mere luck. What she saw instead left her questioning everything she assumed about mathematical intuition. The boy wasn't working through the problem step by step. He was dancing with it, approaching it from angles that weren't taught in any textbook she knew. One diagram in particular caught her attention. A spiraling pattern that elegantly represented a mathematical transformation that typically required pages of calculations to express. "That's not something you learn in middle school," she murmured to herself. "That's not something most people learn, period." Later that afternoon, Elijah was working quietly in a corner when the lab door burst open. A young man in his early 20s stormed in, his expensive loafers squeaking against the polished floor. He stopped when he spotted Elijah, eyes narrowing. "So, you're the wunderkind everyone's talking about," he said, voice dripping with disdain. "I'm Bryce Whitmore." Elijah looked up briefly, then returned to his notebook without responding. "My father is Dr. Jonathan Whitmore," Bryce continued, moving closer. "The man whose formula you supposedly corrected?" When Elijah remained silent, Bryce leaned against the table, deliberately blocking his view. "Let me guess. You saw this problem before, right? Memorized some obscure paper? Or maybe your little charity program coached you." Elijah gathered his notebook, and stood up to move to another table. "Oh, now you're ignoring me?" Bryce laughed coldly. "Look, kid, I get it. You're 15. Minutes of fame. Very cute. But this is my father's life work, not some publicity stunt for diversity outreach." Elijah stopped, his back still turned. "I didn't memorize anything," he said quietly. "I just saw the pattern." "Right," Bryce scoffed. "The pattern that world-class mathematicians missed for decades, but a 12-year-old charity case spotted immediately. The teaching assistant finally intervened. "Mr. Whitmore, I need to ask you to leave." Bryce raised his hands in mock surrender, just having a friendly chat. He looked directly at Elijah. "See you around, Wunderkind." After Bryce left, Elijah didn't return to his work. He sat quietly at the new table, staring out the window until Ms. Jackson came to take him to dinner. That night, Elijah couldn't sleep. The hotel room felt suffocating and the patterns in his mind refused to quiet down. At midnight, he slipped out of bed and picked up the phone. "Professor Shaw, this is Elijah Carter," he said when she answered. "You said I could call if I needed anything. Could I go back to the lab?" To his surprise, Shaw agreed immediately. "I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. The lab was eerily quiet at night. Security cameras blinked silently in the corners as Elijah worked, filling board after board with equations and diagrams. Professor Shaw sat nearby, occasionally asking gentle questions, but mostly observing with growing astonishment. The security footage would later show Elijah working continuously for almost 4 hours, stopping only when Shaw insisted he get some rest. Though he hadn't solved the full theorem, no one expected that. What he had accomplished was something Shaw couldn't quite believe. The next morning, Shaw placed a series of phone calls. First to the STEM outreach program that had brought Elijah to Harvard, then to his school back home. Finally, she called his mother. "Miss Carter, this is Professor Rima Shah from Harvard University. I'm calling about your son, Elijah." "Is he all right?" Miriam Carter's voice was immediately concerned. "He's fine," Shaw assured her. "Actually, he's more than fine. Ms. Carter, I've been working in mathematics education for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what your son can do." A pause. "Elijah's always been good with numbers. This goes beyond being good with numbers. Your son approaches mathematical concepts in ways I've never seen taught." Shaw hesitated. "Ms. Carter, I understand Elijah was homeschooled for several years?" "Yes, by my father until he got too sick last year." "Your father, Elijah's grandfather, does he have a background in mathematics?" Another pause, longer this time. "My father has many backgrounds, Professor Shaw. He was a private man who valued education." Shaw made a note. "Could I speak with him about Elijah's mathematical development?" "No," Miriam said firmly. "My father doesn't speak to institutions anymore, not since the 60s. That afternoon, Shaw invited Elijah to her office. The boy looked tired but calmer than he had been the previous day. "Elijah," she said gently, "I'd like you to explain to me how you see these problems. Not the formal equations, but how you actually visualize them in your mind." Elijah fidgeted, unused to being asked to articulate his thought process. "It's like music, I guess, but you see it instead of hear it." "Music?" Shaw raised her eyebrows. "The patterns move," Elijah explained haltingly. "When something's wrong, it sounds wrong, like a wrong note. The symmetry breaks." He opened his notebook, pointing to one of his diagrams. "This part here, it's supposed to flow into this section, but in Dr. Whitmore's version there was a disruption, like someone playing the wrong chord." Shaw leaned forward. "And these diagrams you draw, where did you learn to make them?" Elijah shrugged. "I didn't. I just need them to see clearly." "Did your grandfather teach you to think about math this way?" Elijah looked up sharply. "Grandpa Joseph just let me ask questions. He never told me I was wrong for seeing things differently." Shaw nodded thoughtfully. "Elijah, do you know what synesthesia is? When your senses mix up, like seeing colors when you hear music?" "Something like that. I think you might experience mathematics in a similar way, through multiple sensory frameworks at once. It's rare, but it can create unique insights. She smiled. It's not wrong. It's a gift. Elijah looked down at his hands. Dr. Whitmore doesn't think so. Dr. Whitmore is having a difficult time, Shah said diplomatically. Indeed, at that very moment, Whitmore was in Dean Langford's office pacing furiously. This is absurd, Richard, he snapped. No one breaks that much ground on the theorem in 24 hours without prior knowledge or coaching. Dean Langford sighed. Jonathan, I understand your frustration, but nothing. I've spent 15 years on this work, 15 years, and now some random child supposedly intuits a breakthrough overnight? Whitmore slammed his palm on the desk. I want a full background check. Check if he had access to classified research. Check if his grandfather worked in the field. Classified research? Langford raised an eyebrow. Isn't that a stretch? Is it? The algorithm has defense applications. The government has had teams working on similar problems for decades. Langford steepled his fingers. Fine, I'll look into the boy's background discreetly. But Jonathan, if nothing turns up, if this child simply has a remarkable mind, we need to embrace this moment, not fight it. Just find out where he got the information, Whitmore said, coldly, because he didn't get it from thin air. That evening, Elijah was demonstrating a concept to Professor Shah when Dr. Whitmore entered the lab unexpectedly. He froze when he saw what Elijah had written on the board, a continuation of the theorem that incorporated elements Whitmore had publicly dismissed years ago as irrelevant. What is this? Whitmore demanded. Shah stood protectively beside Elijah. Dr. Whitmore, Elijah has made some fascinating connections regarding the theorem's applications in— I can see what he's done, Whitmore interrupted sharply. What I want to know is how a child with no formal training is supposedly revolutionizing concepts that have stumped the field's best minds for generations. Other faculty members had gathered at the commotion. One of them stepped forward, studying Elijah's work. Jonathan, she said slowly, he's integrating your early work on dimensional symmetry with the current theorem. It's actually quite elegant. Elegant? Whitmore sputtered. It completely contradicts established methodologies. Maybe those methodologies need contradicting, someone murmured. All eyes turned to Elijah, who stood silently beside the board, his worn notebook clutched tightly in his hands. In that moment, with cameras again capturing his image, the quiet boy from an inner-city school became more than a viral moment. He became a direct challenge to academic authority itself. And in the whispers that followed, something shifted in the air, the beginning of questions that would soon cascade beyond the walls of Harvard and into the wider world. The morning sun cast long shadows across Elijah's hotel room as he scrolled through the news articles on the tablet Ms. Jackson had borrowed from the university. His name appeared in headlines across educational journals and mainstream media alike, each one more sensational than the last. Harvard stunned by 12-year-old math prodigy. Inner-city student challenges prestigious professor. Mathematical miracle or memorized response. That last one made Elijah's stomach twist. The article questioned whether his contribution had been authentic, or if he'd been prepared to create a feel-good viral moment. Another article called him a pawn in academic politics. Some comments questioned how a boy with his background could possibly grasp concepts that challenged established mathematicians. Don't read that garbage, Ms. Jackson said, gently taking the tablet from his hands. They always try to tear down what they don't understand. Elijah nodded, but the doubt had already planted itself in his mind. Had he made a mistake by speaking up? His grandfather had always warned him about drawing too much attention. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Professor Shah stood in the hallway, her usual composed demeanor slightly ruffled. Elijah, she said, I need to speak with you. Privately, if possible. Ms. Jackson hesitated but stepped outside after Elijah nodded that it was okay. Something's happening, Shah said once they were alone. Dr. Whitmore has been making calls all morning. He's requesting access to government databases to look into your family background. Elijah's eyes widened. Why? He's convinced you couldn't have reached these mathematical insights on your own. She sighed. Elijah, is there anything you haven't told me about your grandfather? Anything that might explain why Whitmore is so determined to find a connection? Elijah looked down at his hands. Grandpa Joseph doesn't talk much about his past. He just taught me to see numbers differently. Shah nodded slowly. Elijah, I believe in your ability. I've seen how your mind works. But Whitmore is powerful in academic circles, and he's determined to discredit you. Before Elijah could respond, there was another knock. This time, Dr. Whitmore himself entered without waiting for permission, flanked by Dean Langford. Mr. Carter, Whitmore said coldly, we need to discuss the source of your mathematical insights. Shah stood protectively beside Elijah. Dr. Whitmore, this is highly inappropriate. Elijah is a minor, and his guardian is being informed as we speak, Dean Langford interrupted. Professor Shah, this is a matter of intellectual property and potential security concerns. Whitmore stepped forward, a folder in his hand. Joseph Carter, he said, watching Elijah's face closely. Your grandfather worked on military encryption projects during the Cold War. Elijah blinked in surprise. What? Project Symmetry, Whitmore continued. A top-secret mathematical framework developed for code breaking. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? The same foundation as the theorem you so miraculously improved yesterday. I don't know anything about that, Elijah said, his voice barely audible. Really? Whitmore slapped a black and white photograph on the table. A much younger Joseph Carter stood in a laboratory beside other scientists. Your grandfather had access to classified mathematical frameworks that mysteriously disappeared when he abruptly left the program in 1972. Shah picked up the photo. This proves nothing except that his grandfather was a mathematician. A mathematician who vanished from academia with government property, Whitmore countered. And now, 50 years later, his grandson appears with insights that mirror the exact work that went missing. He turned to Elijah. Did he train you to memorize these formulas? Was this some kind of revenge against the academic establishment that rejected him? Elijah stared at the photograph of his grandfather, young, serious, wearing a lab coat with an ID badge. This wasn't the gentle, soft-spoken man who taught him to see the music in numbers. My granddad just wanted me to understand, Elijah said finally. He said knowledge was beautiful but dangerous if people used it wrong. He looked up at Whitmore. He told me it was dangerous to finish this formula. A tense silence filled the room. Dean Langford and Whitmore exchanged glances. Dangerous. How? Langford asked. Before Elijah could answer, the door burst open and Ms. Jackson rushed in. What's going on here? You have no right to question him without me present. Ms. Jackson, please understand, Langford began. There are complicated circumstances. I don't care how complicated they are, she interrupted. Elijah is coming with me right now. Shah placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. I think that's for the best. This meeting is over. As they left the room, Elijah overheard a faculty member in the hallway whisper, We should send him home before we look foolish for making such a big deal about this. The words stung more than he expected. Home. Yes, that's where he needed to be. While Ms. Jackson argued with Dean Langford about their treatment of Elijah, the boy slipped away unnoticed. The campus grounds were disorienting, but Elijah had always been good with spatial relationships. He found his way to the shuttle stop and, with the emergency cash his mother had given him, bought a ticket back to the city. Professor Shah noticed his absence first. She searched the campus, calling his name, checking the mathematics lab and library. By the time they realized he had left Harvard grounds entirely, Elijah was already halfway home. The bus ride gave him time to think. The photograph of his grandfather haunted him. Government projects, missing research, dangerous formulas. What had Grandpa Joseph been involved in, and why had he never told Elijah about his past? The modest apartment building where Elijah lived, with his mother and grandfather, came into view as dusk settled over the city. He climbed the familiar stairs, comforted by the distant sounds of Mrs. Peterson's television on the second floor and the smell of Mr. Williams' spicy cooking from across the hall. When he opened the door, Grandpa Joseph was sitting in his favorite armchair as if he'd been waiting. His weathered hands rested on a wooden cane, and his eyes, still sharp despite his 80 years, fixed immediately on Elijah. "I saw you on the news," Joseph said quietly. Elijah dropped his backpack and stood awkwardly in the doorway. "They showed me your picture from when you were young." Joseph nodded slowly. "I figured they might dig that up. Why didn't you tell me?" The old man gestured to the chair beside him. "Because some knowledge carries a burden, son. I wanted you to love mathematics for its beauty, not fear it for its power." Elijah sat down, clutching his notebook. "Dr. Whitmore said you stole research from a government project." A bitter smile crossed Joseph's face. "Is that what they're saying now? That I stole it?" He shook his head. "I created it, Elijah. Me and a few others. We built a mathematical framework so powerful it scared us." "What does it do?" "At its core, it predicts patterns with perfect accuracy. Any patterns. Weather systems, stock markets, human behavior." Joseph's voice dropped lower. "We thought we were creating a tool for understanding. Then I realized they wanted a weapon." "A weapon?" "Information is power, Elijah. Imagine knowing exactly how systems will respond before anyone else does. Imagine being able to trigger specific outcomes by introducing carefully calculated variables." Joseph leaned forward. "I left when I understood what they really wanted to use it for. They let me go on one condition, that I never complete the work or share what I knew." Elijah looked down at his notebook, suddenly seeing his innocent patterns in a new light. "And I just announced part of it to the world." Joseph placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "You couldn't have known. Your mind sees the patterns naturally. It's a gift and a responsibility." The front door opened, and Elijah's mother Miriam walked in, still wearing her hospital scrubs. Her eyes widened when she saw her son. "Elijah, what are you doing home?" She rushed to embrace him. "I've been getting calls from Harvard all afternoon. They said you disappeared." "I'm sorry, Mom. I just needed to come home." Miriam looked from her son to her father, sensing the heaviness in the room. "What's happened?" Joseph nodded toward the television. "Turn it on. They're talking about our boy." The news showed footage of Elijah at Harvard, followed by a press conference where Dr. Whitmore questioned the authenticity of Elijah's contributions. A statement from Harvard mentioned an ongoing review of all circumstances surrounding the mathematical demonstration. Miriam turned off the TV. "Those vultures," she muttered. She sat beside Elijah. "Baby, I should have been there with you." "It's okay, Mom. I understand why you couldn't." A shadow crossed Miriam's face. "There's something you should know." She took a deep breath. "I was once a student at Harvard." Elijah stared at her in shock. "What?" "It was a long time ago. I was on a scholarship studying biology. Dr. Whitmore was a young professor then, and he offered to mentor me." Her voice hardened. "Until I questioned one of his research methods. He accused me of academic dishonesty, and with his influence, my scholarship was revoked." "That's why you never told me," Elijah whispered. Miriam nodded. "I didn't want my experience to color yours. I wanted you to see opportunities without my shadows hanging over them." She took his hands in hers. "But I never imagined you'd end up facing the same man who drove me away." Joseph cleared his throat. "History has a way of circling back on itself. The question now is what we do about it." "We fight," Miriam said firmly. "If Whitmore thinks he can discredit my son the way he did me, he's gravely mistaken." At Harvard, Professor Shaw was examining Elijah's notes for the 4th time. Something about his approach had been nagging at her, something beyond his intuitive understanding of the theorem. "He's not copying," she murmured to herself as the patterns became clear. "He's rederiving the work through entirely different conceptual frameworks." She compared Elijah's diagrams with the historical records of project symmetry that Dean Langford had reluctantly shared with her. While the ends were similar, the paths were entirely different. Joseph Carter's team had used conventional mathematics, pushed to extraordinary limits. Elijah was using an entirely novel visual spatial approach that the government researchers had never explored. Her phone rang. It was Dr. Harold Evers, a colleague from the computer science department. "Rima, you need to be careful," he said without preamble. "Whitmore's making calls to Washington about the boy's work." "On what grounds?" "He's claiming national security implications. Says the theorem connects to encrypted communication protocols that the government has patents on." Shah felt a chill. He's trying to seize control of Elijah's work before anyone realizes its value. Exactly. And Langford's backing him. There's talk of legal action if the boy doesn't turn over his notes for security review. After hanging up, Shah stared at Elijah's equations. The pure mathematics was beautiful, but now she understood why Joseph Carter had walked away from it decades ago. In the right hands, these patterns could revolutionize how information systems functioned. In the wrong hands. The next morning, Dean Langford himself appeared at the Carters' doorstep. "Mrs. Carter," he said with a practiced smile, "I apologize for the confusion yesterday. We're deeply concerned about Elijah and want to make things right." Miriam stood firmly in the doorway. "I'm listening. Harvard would like to offer Elijah a full scholarship, effective immediately for our advanced youth program, and eventually for undergraduate studies. We'll provide a stipend, housing when needed, and media training to help him navigate the attention he's receiving." Elijah, listening from the living room, noticed his grandfather's face harden. "And in exchange?" Miriam asked coldly. Langford's smile didn't waver. "We'd need Elijah to sign over his notes and mathematical work to the university, standard procedure for research developed within our institutions. Except Elijah developed his insights before he ever set foot on your campus," Miriam replied. "A technicality we're willing to overlook given the generous nature of our offer." Joseph stood up, leaning heavily on his cane as he approached the door. "Dean Langford, I recognize a government contract writer when I hear one. Who exactly is claiming ownership of my grandson's work? Harvard or someone else?" Langford's smile finally faltered. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, there are national interests at stake that supersede." "I think you should leave," Miriam interrupted. "Any further communication can go through our attorney." After Langford left, Professor Shah called. She'd heard about his visit and was concerned. "Elijah," she said when he came to the phone, "I need you to understand something important. What you've discovered isn't just clever mathematics. It could fundamentally change how information systems work." "Is that why everyone's so interested?" "Yes, but it also means you need to be careful about who controls this knowledge." She paused. "There's a press conference being organized by some of my colleagues. We want to help you tell your story before others define it for you." That afternoon, cameras gathered outside the local community center. With Professor Shah on one side and his mother on the other, Elijah faced the media for the first time. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was clear. "I love mathematics because it tells the truth," he said simply. "The patterns I see aren't about Harvard or awards or who gets credit. They're about understanding something beautiful." A reporter called out, "Are you responding to Dr. Whitmore's claims that your work is derivative of existing classified research?" Elijah looked at his grandfather, who nodded encouragingly. "My grandfather taught me to see mathematics differently," Elijah responded. "But the work I did at Harvard was my own. This isn't about institutions. It's about something bigger, something that belongs to everyone." As the press conference concluded, no one noticed the black sedan parked across the street, its occupants photographing everyone who attended. The story that had begun as an academic curiosity was about to become something far more consequential. 3 days after the press conference, Elijah sat cross-legged on the floor of Professor Shah's home office, surrounded by papers covered in equations. He'd been coming here each afternoon after school, working in the safety of Shah's modest townhouse rather than Harvard's labs. "Look at this," Elijah said suddenly, pointing to a sequence he'd been developing. "When you extend the pattern in 3 dimensions, it creates a perfect encryption key." Shah leaned forward, studying the elegant solution. Though it appeared unrelated to the original theorem, she immediately recognized its significance. "Elijah," she said carefully. "Do you understand what you've just done?" He shrugged. "It's just another application of the symmetry principle." "It's not just another application. This mirrors the foundation of modern digital encryption, but it's exponentially more efficient." She set the paper down. "You may have created a master key that could potentially unlock any digital security system built on current mathematical models." Elijah's eyes widened as the implications sank in. "That's not good, is it?" "It depends on who controls it." Shah sat beside him. "Elijah, you may be on the edge of something people will try to take from you, not just because it's genius, but because it's power. The kind of power governments and corporations would do almost anything to possess." Elijah stared at his equations, seeing them through new eyes. Not just beautiful patterns, but keys to digital kingdoms. "What should I do?" he asked quietly. "For now, we keep this between us." Shah gathered the papers carefully. "And we think very carefully about what happens next." Meanwhile, at Harvard, Dr. Whitmore paced his office, phone pressed to his ear. "Yes, I understand the urgency," he said. "But the boy isn't on campus anymore, and his mother has retained legal counsel. Yes, of course I see the opportunity here." He paused, listening. "If I can position myself as the academic interpreter of his work, I could bridge the gap between his raw insights and practical applications." After hanging up, Whitmore stared at the photo of himself receiving the Presidential Medal of Science. For decades, he'd pursued the recognition his brilliance deserved. The Nobel had eluded him, but if he could harness Elijah's breakthrough and frame it properly, the prize would finally be within reach. His door opened without a knock. Dean Langford entered, looking agitated. "Jonathan, we have a situation. A tech CEO is trying to bypass us and reach the Carter family directly." "Which one?" "Maxwell Walsh from Quantum Lock Systems. He's offering the boy mentorship, funding, and a private research lab." Whitmore cursed under his breath. "That vulture. What did the family say?" "Unknown. But Walsh has the resources to make this very attractive." Langford loosened his tie. "Jonathan, if we lose control of this, the university's position will be severely compromised. I'm aware." Whitmore drummed his fingers on the desk. "Where's my son? Bryce might be useful here." Bryce Whitmore had, in fact, been avoiding his father. The videos of Elijah's press conference had affected him more than he cared to admit. The boy's simple dignity contrasted sharply with his father's increasingly desperate attempts to discredit him. That evening, Bryce found himself parked outside the modest apartment building where the Carters lived. He wasn't entirely sure why he'd come, but something compelled him to understand more about the boy who'd inadvertently upended his father's carefully constructed world. As he sat there, the building's door opened, and Elijah emerged with a woman Bryce assumed was his mother. They walked to a nearby park, where Elijah opened a book and began reading on a bench while his mother made a phone call nearby. Bryce approached slowly, hands in his pockets. "Hey," he said awkwardly when Elijah looked up. Recognition flashed in the boy's eyes, followed by wariness. "What do you want?" "Just to talk." Bryce gestured to the bench. "May I?" Elijah hesitated but nodded. Bryce sat, keeping a respectful distance. "I want to apologize for how I acted at Harvard. I was a jerk." Elijah studied him cautiously. "Why are you here now?" "Honestly, I'm not sure." Bryce sighed. "Maybe because my father is acting in ways that don't sit right with me. He doesn't like me very much." "It's not about you," Bryce said. "It's about what you represent. My father's built his career on being the smartest person in every room. Then you came along and—" He trailed off, realizing how it sounded. "I didn't mean to embarrass him," Elijah said quietly. "I know. That's part of why I'm here." Bryce hesitated. "There are emails. Internal Harvard communications. My father is planning to file intellectual property claims against you and your family." Elijah's eyes widened. Can he do that? He's trying. But it won't work if people know what he's doing. Bryce met Elijah's gaze. I could help expose it. Before Elijah could respond, his mother noticed Bryce and hurried over. Elijah, who is this? She asked, her voice tense. Bryce Whitmore, he replied, standing. Dr. Whitmore's son. Miriam's expression hardened. I think you should leave. Mom, he's trying to help, Elijah protested. He says his father is going to try to take my work legally. Miriam looked skeptical. And why would you turn against your father, Mr. Whitmore? Bryce met her gaze steadily. Because I've spent my life watching him take credit for other people's ideas while crushing anyone who challenges him, including you, Miss Carter. Miriam flinched. You know who I am. I found the records of your time at Harvard. What he did to you was wrong. Bryce looked at Elijah. And I won't let him do it again. Later that night, Professor Shaw received an encrypted email containing dozens of internal Harvard communications. As she read through them, a disturbing picture emerged, not just of Whitmore's plans to claim Elijah's work, but of a broader academic conspiracy. She called a trusted colleague, Dr. Lin from MIT. James, I need to show you something. There appears to be a coordinated effort among certain faculty to control breakthrough research. They call themselves the Conclave. Where did you get this? Lin asked after reviewing the documents. From an unexpected ally. What concerns me most is how systematic this is. They've been doing this for years, identifying promising research from marginalized students and finding ways to appropriate it. This goes beyond academic misconduct, Linny said grimly. Some of these email threads include government contacts. Shaw rubbed her temples. James, they're specifically targeting Elijah's work because it has encryption applications. We need to protect him. How? Harvard has resources we can't match. Maybe we don't need to match them. Maybe we just need to make this too public for them to control. The next morning, Elijah was eating breakfast when his mother received a call. Her expression darkened as she listened. That's outrageous, she said finally. You have absolutely no grounds for such claims. After hanging up, she sat heavily at the table. That was Dean Langford. He says Harvard is filing educational neglect claims based on your homeschooling records. Joseph's hand tightened around his coffee mug. What exactly are they claiming? That the homeschooling was inadequate and unregistered. Miriam's voice shook with anger. They're threatening to involve child services if we don't cooperate with their demands for Elijah's research. Elijah looked from his mother to his grandfather. Can they do that? Take me away? No, Miriam said firmly. But they're hoping the threat will be enough to make us give in. Grandpa Joseph reached for his cane. Call Professor Shaw. It's time to take more decisive action. That evening, major news outlets broke the story. Harvard faculty exposed and schemed to appropriate student research. The leaked emails revealed not just Whitmore's personal vendetta against Elijah, but a long-standing practice of institutional theft targeting promising students from underrepresented backgrounds. Public support for Elijah surged. Social media campaigns with hashtags like #Stand with Elijah and Protect the Boy spread across platforms. Several prominent academics issued statements condemning Harvard's actions. With the spotlight firmly on the university, Shaw and Elijah enacted the next phase of their plan. Late that night, they carefully photographed every page of Elijah's notes and encrypted the files using a system only they understood. Are you sure about this? Shaw asked as Elijah prepared to send the encrypted files to trusted mathematicians around the world. Elijah nodded. Grandpa Joseph always said knowledge becomes dangerous when it's controlled by too few people. He pressed send. Now it belongs to everyone. Within hours, mathematics forums worldwide lit up with discussions of Elijah's work. Experts from Beijing to Berlin confirmed that his approach represented a fundamental shift in how certain mathematical problems could be approached. The next morning, as Elijah prepared for school, his grandfather called him into the living room. Joseph sat by the window watching the sunrise with a peaceful expression. You did something brave last night, the old man said. Braver than I was at your age. Elijah sat beside him. I was scared. Being scared and being brave aren't opposites, son. They usually go hand in hand. Joseph placed a weathered hand on Elijah's shoulder. I spent decades hiding what I knew because I feared how it would be used. You chose to share it so it couldn't be weaponized. That's the difference. Elijah looked down at his notebook, now just one copy among many. Do you think it was the right thing? I think, Joseph said slowly, that you understood something I took years to learn. Some knowledge is too powerful for any one person to own. He smiled at his grandson. Your work isn't about solving a formula anymore. It's about making sure what comes next is in everyone's hands, not just the powerful few. As Elijah left for school, reporters gathered outside their apartment building. But for the first time since this all began, he walked with his head held high, no longer afraid of the attention. The formula that had started as a correction on a Harvard chalkboard had become something far greater. A symbol of knowledge freely shared, beyond the control of those who would hoard it for power or profit. And in that moment, the 12-year-old boy who had raised his hand in a Harvard lecture hall understood that he had changed not just a mathematical theorem, but potentially the world itself. Elijah woke to the sound of his mother's voice. She was on the phone in the kitchen, her tone hushed but urgent. He checked the clock, 6:22 a.m. Through the thin apartment walls, he caught fragments of her conversation. Everywhere overnight. No, we haven't spoken to any. Yes, Joseph is aware. Curious, Elijah slipped out of bed and padded to his desk where Ms. Jackson had set up a refurbished laptop, a gift from the STEM program. He opened the browser and blinked in surprise. His name dominated the headlines of major news sites and scientific journals alike. 12-year-old's math. Breakthrough goes global. Carter equations reshape mathematical approach to encryption. Harvard. Under fire as young genius's work transforms field. The mathematics forums were exploding with analysis of his work. Expert mathematicians from Tokyo to Toronto were building on his equations, confirming his approach, and expanding it in directions Elijah hadn't even considered. Within hours of Shah distributing his notes, the global mathematical community had validated what Harvard had tried to control and taken it further. You're up early, his grandfather said from the doorway, leaning on his cane. Everyone's talking about it, Elijah said, still scrolling through the coverage. Is that good or bad? Joseph lowered himself carefully into a chair beside Elijah. It's both. The truth often is. He glanced at the screen. They're calling it the Carter formulation now. Before Elijah could respond, his mother appeared in the doorway, her face tight with worry. Elijah, you're not going to school today, she said. There are reporters camped outside the building, and I've received calls from 3 different news stations. What about your work? Elijah asked. I've taken personal leave. She crossed her arms. We need to be careful about how we handle this. Professor Shah called. She's coming over to help us navigate the situation. An hour later, Shah arrived, slipping past the journalists with help from Mr. Williams, who created a distraction by loudly complaining about their blocking of the apartment entrance. Once inside, she spread several newspapers on the kitchen table. It's not just academic interest anymore, she explained. You've become a symbol, Elijah. People are celebrating you not just as a mathematical prodigy, but as someone who stood up to institutional gatekeeping. Joseph picked up one of the articles. And how is Harvard responding? Shah's expression darkened. Not well. Whitmore is on the offensive, claiming Elijah violated research ethics by exposing sensitive material with potential national security implications. That's absurd, Miriam protested. He's a child who solved a math problem. A math problem. With encryption applications, Shah reminded her gently. Whitmore has filed formal complaints with several federal agencies. He's trying to frame this as a national security issue to regain control. As if to confirm her words, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, Miriam saw a man in a crisp suit, holding government identification. Mrs. Carter, I'm Daniel Fletcher with the National Security Agency. I'd like to speak with you and your son regarding his recent mathematical publication. Joseph's face darkened. The playbook hasn't changed in 50 years, he muttered, gesturing for Miriam to let the man in. Fletcher was polite but direct. "We're conducting a routine evaluation of intellectual property with potential defense implications," he explained, sitting stiffly on the couch. "Nothing to be concerned about. We just need to understand the origins and scope of Elijah's work." "You mean you need to determine if it should be classified?" Joseph said flatly. Fletcher smiled thinly. "Mr. Carter, your background gives you unique insight into these matters. My background taught me to recognize government overreach when—" "I see it," Joseph replied. While the adults talked, Elijah retreated to his room, the tension making his stomach knot. He had only wanted to solve an interesting problem, to show what was possible. Now there were government agents in his living room and reporters outside his door. His phone pinged with a text from his school principal. "Need to speak with your mother. Please call when convenient." Later that afternoon, Miriam ended a tense phone call with the principal, her face flushed with anger. "Elijah, the school says they've received complaints about disruption caused by media interest in you. They're asking that you stay home until things settle down." "Complaints from whom?" Shaw asked sharply. "Anonymous concerned parents," Miriam said bitterly. "But the timing is suspiciously convenient." Joseph nodded grimly. "Pressure tactics. Isolate the boy. Make life difficult for the family. Hope will give in." "Give in to what exactly?" Elijah asked, his voice small. Shaw and his mother exchanged glances. "They want control, Elijah," Shaw explained gently. "Control of your work, your story, and how your discovery is used." That evening, Shaw introduced them to Laura Bennett, a civil rights attorney specializing in academic freedom cases. "We need to be proactive," Bennett advised. "I recommend filing a motion to classify Elijah's work as protected academic output, not state property. It won't stop them completely, but it creates legal hurdles they'll have to overcome." After the lawyer left, Elijah sat alone in his room, the weight of the situation crushing down on him. The equations that had once seemed so beautiful now felt like a burden. Tears welled in his eyes as pressure and confusion overwhelmed him. Miriam found him there, curled on his bed. She sat beside him and stroked his hair gently. "I just wanted to show it was possible," Elijah sobbed. "I didn't mean for all this to happen." Miriam pulled him close. "You did more than show it was possible," she whispered. "You opened a door for the world, and some people are afraid of what might come through that door. I wish I'd never raised my hand that day," he said. "No, you don't." Miriam lifted his chin. "You spoke your truth. Never regret that, no matter what comes after." The following morning brought unexpected news. Bryce Whitmore had given a televised interview with a major network, openly condemning his father's actions. "What my father and Harvard are doing is wrong," Bryce said, looking directly into the camera. "Elijah Carter earned every bit of his mathematical insight through genuine brilliance, not through any improper means as some have suggested." The interviewer leaned forward. "You're directly contradicting your father's claims. Why come forward now?" "Because I was there," Bryce replied. "I saw how Elijah worked, how he approached problems differently, and I've seen the emails showing how my father and others plan to take credit for his breakthroughs." He looked down briefly. "I was also part of the problem at first. I treated Elijah badly because I was jealous and because that's how I was raised to behave. I'm not proud of that." The interview sent shockwaves through academic circles. Several Harvard donors threatened to withdraw support unless the university addressed the scandal transparently. Student protests erupted on campus, demanding accountability. Meanwhile, Elijah's work continued to ripple across the mathematical world. A young mathematician from Nigeria named Adebayo Okafor published a paper building on Elijah's equations, demonstrating how they could simplify encryption methods used in medical data transmission and financial systems. "The beauty of Carter's approach," Okafor wrote, "is that it creates pathways previously thought impossible. This 12-year-old boy has potentially saved us decades of incremental progress." As the pressure mounted, Shaw suggested a new strategy. "Elijah, I think you should write a public statement, in your own words. People are talking about you, but they need to hear from you directly." Elijah hesitated. "What would I say?" The truth, as you see it. With Shah's guidance, Elijah composed a letter that spoke to the heart of what he believed. Mathematics doesn't belong to one person or one institution. It's like music. You're supposed to share it so everyone can hear the beautiful patterns. I never wanted to own these ideas. I just wanted to understand them, and now I want others to understand them too. The world gets better when knowledge is free. The letter, released online, went viral within hours. Its simplicity and earnestness resonated far beyond academic circles, touching something fundamental about the nature of discovery and knowledge. In the days that followed, Elijah watched as his mathematical insights, now freely available to all, began to inspire new applications and innovations. Researchers across disciplines found ways to apply his approach to problems in climate modeling, medicine, and communication systems. What had begun as a correction on a Harvard chalkboard had become a global conversation about mathematics, institutional power, and who gets to own ideas. And at the center of it all was a 12-year-old boy who had simply raised his hand to point out a pattern no one else had seen. The early morning fog had just begun to lift when a black car pulled up outside the Carter's apartment building. The reporters who had maintained their vigil over the past weeks barely glanced up. Another government agent or lawyer, they assumed. But the tall, distinguished black man who emerged was neither. Dr. Harold Evers moved with the deliberate pace of someone in his 80s, his silver hair neatly trimmed, his eyes sharp behind round glasses. The reporters didn't recognize him, but Joseph Carter did. When Miriam opened the door to his knock, Joseph was already standing behind her, a look of disbelief on his face. "Harold," he said softly, "I thought you were dead." Evers smiled thinly. "The rumors of my demise were greatly exaggerated, old friend. May I come in?" Once inside, Evers introduced himself to Elijah. "I knew your grandfather when we were both young men working on problems no one else understood." He studied Elijah's face. "The resemblance is remarkable, not just in features, but in how you see the world." Elijah glanced at his grandfather, who nodded slowly. "Dr. Evers was my colleague during the Cold War," Joseph explained. "We worked together on Project Symmetry until we discovered what they really wanted to use it for," Evers finished. "I chose a different path than your grandfather. I stayed within the system, trying to guide it toward more ethical applications." He sighed heavily. "I'm not sure either of us got it right." From his worn leather briefcase, Evers withdrew several yellowed notebooks, their pages filled with faded equations. "These were encrypted using a cipher Joseph and I developed. I kept them hidden all these years." Joseph opened one reverently, running his fingers over the familiar handwriting. "You saved them." "Of course I did. Our work was too important to lose, even if we couldn't publish it." Evers turned to Elijah. "Young man, what you've rediscovered, and, more importantly, what you've chosen to do with it, is why I'm here. These pages echo what you've been discovering on your own." Elijah leaned forward to examine the notebooks. The notation was different from modern mathematics, but he could see the underlying patterns, similar to what he'd intuited, but approached through different methods. "You're seeing the language we were too afraid to write plainly," Evers explained. "We encoded it, thinking we were protecting the world. Your grandfather walked away entirely. I stayed but hid the most dangerous insights." He smiled sadly. "And here you are, seeing it all clearly and choosing to share it openly with the world." Miriam watched this exchange with growing emotion. "Dad," she said finally, "I think it's time you told me everything. No more fragments, no more half-truths." Joseph nodded slowly. The three adults moved to the kitchen table while Elijah continued examining the old notebooks. "I never told you the full story because I wanted to protect you," Joseph began. "What we discovered in the 60s wasn't just mathematics. It was a framework for predicting and potentially controlling complex systems. The government saw it as the ultimate intelligence tool. They wanted to weaponize it," Evers added. "Imagine being able to destabilize an enemy's economy by introducing precisely calibrated variables, or predicting exactly how populations would respond to information campaigns." "I refused to complete the work," Joseph continued. I destroyed my notes and walked away from academia entirely. They let me go on condition that I never speak about what I knew. He reached for Miriam's hand. That's why I was so careful about your education, why I kept our family under the radar. Miriam squeezed his hand. All those years I thought you were just being paranoid, eccentric. Tears welled in her eyes. I'm sorry I didn't understand. You couldn't have known, Joseph replied softly. I made sure of that. From the living room, Elijah called out, Grandpa, look at this. He was pointing to a sequence in one of the old notebooks that mirrored his recent work. As the family gathered around the notebooks, Evers explained, Your grandfather and I feared what would happen if our complete framework fell into the wrong hands. But times have changed. The model your grandson has developed, and more importantly, shared openly, might actually be safer than what we tried to do. How so? Miriam asked. Because no one controls it, Evers replied. When knowledge is distributed across thousands of minds worldwide, it can't be weaponized as easily as when it's concentrated in the hands of a few. Later that day, Elijah received an unexpected email from the organizers of TEDx Youth, inviting him to give a talk about his experience and mathematical insights. They want me to speak? In front of people? Elijah looked terrified at the prospect. Shah, who had arrived to help the family navigate their new reality, smiled encouragingly. It's a tremendous opportunity, Elijah. A chance to tell your story. In your own words, but what would I even say? The truth, his mother said simply. About how you see mathematics and why sharing knowledge matters. Despite his initial reluctance, Elijah agreed to give the talk, with careful preparation from his mother and Professor Shah. For weeks, they worked on his presentation, focusing not on technical details, but on conveying his unique perspective on mathematics. When the day arrived, Elijah stood backstage, heart pounding as he listened to the host's introduction. His mother straightened his tie one last time. Just be yourself, she whispered. That's more than enough. Elijah walked onto the stage, his small figure almost lost against the large red circle of the TEDx logo. He took a deep breath and began speaking. I never thought of myself as special, he said, his voice gaining strength as he continued. I just see numbers differently. To me, mathematics isn't about rules or formulas, it's about stories that want to fit together. As he spoke, projected images showed his distinctive diagrams and visualizations, the way he perceived mathematical relationships as flowing patterns rather than static equations. When I raised my hand that day at Harvard, I wasn't trying to challenge anyone. I just saw a pattern that wasn't flowing right, like a wrong note in a song. He paused, gathering courage for what he wanted to say next. But what happened afterward taught me something important. Knowledge is most powerful when it's shared, when we use what we know to include others instead of shutting them out. By the time he finished his 15-minute talk, the audience was on their feet. The simple eloquence of a 12-year-old explaining complex concepts through vivid metaphors resonated far beyond what anyone expected. Within days, his talk became one of the most viewed TEDx videos in history, translated into dozens of languages. The ripples continued to spread. Harvard, facing mounting public pressure and the leaked internal documents, thanks to Bryce, announced a formal review of Dr. Whitmore's conduct and the university's practices regarding student research. Dean Langford held a somber press conference. We are committed to a thorough examination of how this situation was handled, and to implementing significant changes in our approach to recognizing and supporting diverse mathematical talent. Admission offers from prestigious universities around the world flooded the Carter household, MIT, Oxford, Caltech, and others, offering Elijah early acceptance with full scholarships. Everyone wants you now, Miriam observed, sorting through the envelopes. Elijah looked up from his homework. I just want to go back to normal school, he said, where people don't yell and everything isn't so serious all the time. His mother smiled. That might not be possible anymore, baby, but we'll find a way forward that works for you. Meanwhile, Professor Shaw and Dr. Evers had been meeting with academic leaders and policy experts. They approached the Carters with a proposal. "We want to establish the Carter Initiative," Shaw explained. "A foundation named after Joseph that would support young, underrepresented mathematical talents around the world. The idea," Evers continued, "is to create pathways for students who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional institutions, the way both Joseph and Elijah were." Joseph leaned forward, eyes bright with interest. "And you want to use Elijah's work as the foundation?" "With your permission," Shaw nodded. "The mathematical framework he's developed could become an open-source platform for collaborative problem-solving across disciplines." As they discussed the details, Dr. Whitmore was making one last desperate attempt to salvage his reputation and claim some connection to the breakthrough. He sent a message directly to Joseph, offering substantial payment for collaboration on a historical account of the mathematical developments leading to Elijah's discovery. Joseph's response was brief. "You've already rewritten enough history. I'll pass." A week later, Harvard issued a formal statement acknowledging Elijah's contribution and apologizing for institutional failures in recognizing and supporting his extraordinary work. The statement mentioned that Dr. Whitmore had resigned his position, effective immediately. That evening, the Carter family sat together in their living room. The apartment that had once seemed too small now felt like exactly what they needed, a space of their own, away from the noise of the world that had suddenly become so interested in them. "What happens now?" Elijah asked, looking from his mother to his grandfather. Joseph smiled gently. "Now you continue becoming who you're meant to be. The mathematics will always be there, but how you use it, that's the real question. The legacy question," Evers had called it during their last conversation. "Not what you discover, but what you do with the discovery." As Elijah considered this, he realized that the pattern he'd spotted on the Harvard chalkboard had led to something far more important than mathematical recognition. It had revealed truths about institutions and power, about knowledge, and who gets to claim it. But most importantly, it had shown him that a single voice, even a small, hesitant one, could change the conversation entirely. All it took was the courage to raise his hand. The familiar rhythm of locker doors slamming and sneakers squeaking against linoleum filled the halls of Wilson Middle School. 3 months had passed since the Harvard incident, and while the media frenzy had gradually subsided, Elijah's return to school still caused heads to turn. "There he is," a 7th grader whispered to his friend as Elijah walked past. "The math genius." Elijah kept his eyes on the floor, clutching his books tighter against his chest. Fame was a strange burden for a 12-year-old. Some students wanted to be his friend just to say they knew him. Others resented the attention he received. A few, thankfully, treated him no differently than before. "Elijah," called Ms. Rodriguez, his science teacher, waving him into her classroom. "I saved something for you." She handed him a science magazine featuring an article about young innovators. "They wanted to include you, but your mother told them you weren't doing interviews. I thought you might want to see it anyway." Elijah scanned the article, relieved to find only a small mention of his name, alongside other young people who had made scientific contributions. "Thank you," he said with a genuine smile. "How are you settling back in?" Ms. Rodriguez asked gently. Elijah considered the question. The first week had been awkward, with stares and whispers following him everywhere, but his teachers had been protective, and gradually, the novelty had worn off. "It's getting better," he answered honestly. "I'm glad to hear that." She hesitated. "The principal asked me to tell you. We've received an invitation for you to join a national mathematics competition. No pressure, but if you're interested." Elijah shook his head quickly. "I don't think I want to compete, but thank you, Ms. Rodriguez nodded, understanding. "Of course. Just know the opportunity is there if you change your mind." Later that afternoon, Elijah arrived home to find his grandfather at the kitchen table, working through a crossword puzzle. The apartment was quiet, with Miriam still at the hospital for her shift. "How was school?" Joseph asked, not looking up from his puzzle. "Normal," Elijah said, dropping his backpack and heading to the refrigerator. "Which is good." Joseph smiled, watching his grandson pour a glass of orange juice. The boy had grown an inch taller in recent months, his frame still slender but his posture more confident. The wide-eyed terror that had marked his face during the height of the Harvard scandal had faded, replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness that reminded Joseph of himself at a much older age. "I have something to show you," Joseph said, setting aside his crossword. He pulled out a leather-bound journal from beside his chair. "I've been working on this since everything settled down." Elijah sat beside him, curious. The journal contained mathematical notes, elegant, precise formulations that extended some of the concepts from Elijah's original insights. "You're still working on the theorem?" Elijah asked, surprised. Joseph nodded. "In my own way, not for publication or recognition, just for the beauty of it." He turned to a particularly complex equation. "This section here, I couldn't have approached it this way before your work. You went further than I ever dared." Elijah studied the equation, understanding its elegance immediately. "It's beautiful," he said simply. "I wasn't scared because I had you," Joseph replied, his voice soft with emotion. Something in his grandfather's words struck Elijah deeply. All his life, he had looked to Joseph for guidance and protection. The idea that he had given his grandfather courage in return was a profound revelation. That evening, as Elijah worked on homework at the kitchen table, his mother called from the hospital. "Check your email," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "There's something you need to see." Elijah opened his laptop to find an email with a link to a video compilation. Children from around the world, from bedroom desks in Kenya to classroom blackboards in South Korea, were filming themselves working on what they called the Carter conjecture. Young voices explained their approaches to the mathematical framework Elijah had started, each building on the work in different ways. "It's becoming a movement," Miriam explained over the phone. "Professor Shah sent this to me. These kids are collaborating instead of competing, sharing their insights freely, just like you did." Elijah watched, amazed, as a group of teenagers in Brazil demonstrated how they had applied his visual approach to solve a local engineering problem. A girl in India had created a simplified version that could be taught to younger students. The Carter conjecture, as it was now known worldwide, had transformed from an academic breakthrough into a community effort, an open mathematical problem, encouraging collaboration over competition. A week later, Professor Shah visited with unexpected news. "I've been nominated for the Global Teaching Innovation Prize," she said, almost embarrassed by the attention, "for my work mentoring you and for helping reshape academic gatekeeping practices." "You deserve it," Elijah said sincerely. Since the Harvard incident, Shah had become a vocal advocate for recognizing non-traditional approaches to mathematics and science, particularly from students outside elite academic circles. "There's more," she continued. "The nomination mentioned our work establishing the Carter Initiative. The foundation has already received funding commitments to support 50 young mathematicians from underrepresented backgrounds next year." Joseph nodded approvingly. "That's the real legacy, not the mathematics itself, but the doors it opens for others." As Shah was leaving, she handed Elijah an envelope. "This came to Harvard, addressed to you." Security screened it thoroughly before forwarding it to me. Inside was a handwritten letter on official stationery from the White House. The President of the United States had personally written to commend Elijah's bravery and mathematical contributions. "Your work reminds us what education is truly meant to be," the letter concluded. "Not a competition for prestige or resources, but a collaborative journey toward understanding our world more deeply." Elijah read the letter 3 times, then carefully placed it in his notebook. Unlike the media attention that had made him uncomfortable, this private recognition felt meaningful, an acknowledgement not just of his mathematical ability, but of the choices he had made about sharing knowledge. 2 weeks later, the Carter family received somber news. Dr. Harold Evers had passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83. He had continued working until his final days, helping Professor Shah establish the organizational structure for the Carter Initiative. At the small private memorial service, Evers' daughter handed Elijah a package her father had prepared before his death. "He wanted you to have these," she explained. The package contained 3 items: Ever's old ID badge from the Cold War project, a notebook titled, "For the One Who Listens," and a handwritten note, "Elijah, you have already accomplished what Joseph and I could not. You've transformed mathematical insight into a force for connection rather than division. Now you write the next chapter. Listen to the patterns and remember that the most important discoveries aren't found in equations, but in the hearts of those brave enough to share them." That night, Elijah sat on the fire escape outside his bedroom window, gazing at the city lights while turning Ever's ID badge over in his hands. The weight of these connections to the past, to work begun decades before his birth, felt momentous. His mother climbed out to join him, wrapping a blanket around both their shoulders against the evening chill. "Penny, for your thoughts?" she asked. "I was thinking about the future," Elijah replied. "About what I want to do when I grow up." Miriam smiled. "And what's that?" "I want to open a school someday," he said with quiet certainty. "Not for geniuses or prodigies, but for kids who are scared to raise their hand." His mother pulled him closer. "That's a beautiful dream, Elijah." "Doe, you think it's possible? After everything that's happened, I think you've redefined what's possible." Over the following months, life settled into a new rhythm. Elijah finished the school year with excellent grades across all subjects, not just mathematics. The media attention continued to fade, though. Occasionally, journalists still called seeking interviews or updates. One surprising development was Elijah's occasional email exchanges with Bryce Whitmore. After his public break with his father, Bryce had transferred to a small liberal arts college focused on ethics and philosophy. His messages to Elijah were thoughtful reflections on academic responsibility and the nature of knowledge. "I'm studying the ethics of scientific discovery," Bryce wrote in one email. "Trying to understand where my father went wrong, where I went wrong too." Elijah always responded, usually with simple observations that Bryce later told him were often more insightful than his university lectures. As summer approached, Harvard made an unexpected overture. Dean Langford, still in his position despite the scandal, contacted the family with a proposal to commission a statue of Elijah for their main campus to commemorate his contribution to mathematics and academic inclusivity. The offer left the family stunned. Joseph scoffed openly, calling it a transparent attempt at image rehabilitation. Miriam was more measured, suggesting they consider whether such visibility might inspire other young students. Elijah listened to their perspectives, then wrote a carefully worded response. He would respectfully decline the statue but suggested Harvard consider using those funds to build a youth mathematics center in Boston instead, one that would serve local communities without requiring Harvard affiliation. "If you want to honor what happened," he wrote, "create space for the next person like me to be heard, not just remembered." Harvard agreed. The Boston Youth Mathematics Collaborative broke ground later that year, with Professor Shaw as its academic director. On a warm August night, while his mother worked a late shift and his grandfather slept, Elijah sat at his desk with a fresh notebook open before him. The house was quiet except for the distant sounds of the city floating through his open window. He hadn't told anyone, not even his grandfather, about the new problem he'd begun exploring. Something unrelated to the Carter conjecture, a mathematical question that had occurred to him while watching birds form and reform their patterns in flight. His pencil moved smoothly across the page, sketching initial frameworks rather than formal equations. The familiar sense of patterns emerging, of mathematical music taking shape, filled him with quiet joy. "Let's see what this one does," he whispered to himself, and continued working late into the night, the city lights casting long shadows across his calculations. 10 years had transformed the vacant lot in the Riverside district into something remarkable. Where abandoned buildings had once stood, a sprawling campus of interconnected modern structures now rose, their glass facades reflecting the morning sunlight. Above the main entrance, large letters announced, "The Elijah Carter Institute for Mathematical Thinking." Cars and buses pulled up to the entrance, discharging excited teenagers from all backgrounds. Some arrived in groups, chattering excitedly, while others walked alone, clutching notebooks and looking around in wonder. It was opening day at the Institute, and the energy was palpable. Inside the main hall, a tall young man in a simple blue button-down shirt and jeans stood slightly apart from the gathering crowd, observing quietly. At 22, Elijah Carter carried himself with the same humility that had characterized him as a child, though his slender frame had filled out and his once shy demeanor had matured into thoughtful confidence. He still preferred quiet corners to center stage, still carried a notebook everywhere he went. As students filed past, some did double takes upon recognizing him, while others, too young to remember the events from a decade ago, passed by with only polite smiles. "Mr. Carter?" A volunteer approached him nervously. "Everyone's waiting in the auditorium whenever you're ready." Elijah nodded, taking a deep breath. After years of planning, fundraising, and construction, the moment had arrived. The Institute, a dream born in the aftermath of the Harvard incident, was finally opening its doors. The auditorium fell silent as Elijah walked onto the stage. 500 students, selected from schools across the country, watched with rapt attention. In the front row sat his mother Miriam, and beside her Grandpa Joseph, now 92, his hair completely white but his eyes still bright with intelligence. Professor Shah, now Dr. Shah, after receiving her honorary doctorate, sat with them, along with several educational leaders who had supported the Institute's development. Even Bryce Whitmore had come, having established himself as an advocate for ethical approaches to scientific innovation. Elijah adjusted the microphone, looking out at the diverse crowd of young faces. "Welcome to the first day of something new," he began softly. "When people ask what this institute is about, they expect me to talk about advanced mathematics or breakthrough research. But that's not why we're here." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "We're here because every one of you has a unique way of seeing the world. You don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just need to stay curious. Because curiosity changes everything." His words resonated through the silent auditorium. Unlike the uncertain 12-year-old who had struggled through his TEDx talk years ago, the Elijah who stood before them now spoke with quiet conviction, born of experience. 10 years ago, I raised my hand in a room where I didn't belong, to point out something no one else had noticed. What happened next taught me that the most powerful force in human progress isn't genius, it's courage. The courage to speak when you're afraid, to share what you know when you could keep it to yourself, to help others see what you see. After the speech, Elijah led a tour through the Institute's facilities. The main building housed classrooms and research spaces designed to accommodate various learning styles. Walls could be written on directly, technology was accessible but not dominant, and each area featured flexible furniture that could be rearranged for different kinds of collaboration. "This is our hall of contributors," Elijah explained, leading the group into a long corridor lined with plaques and interactive displays. The first section was titled The Shah Wing, honoring Professor Rima Shah's contributions to mathematical education reform. Next came areas named for Joseph Carter and Harold Evers, celebrating their early work and ethical stance on knowledge sharing. Surprisingly, even Bryce Whitmore had a dedicated space, the Whitmore Ethics Center, which would host discussions and research on responsible innovation. Some people were surprised by that choice, Elijah admitted when a student questioned it. But transformation deserves recognition. Sometimes the most important lessons come from those who change their minds, not those who were right from the start. In a quiet, museum-like room at the Institute's center, Elijah had created a different kind of space. Here, behind glass, rested the final form of the mathematical framework that had changed his life, the complete Carter theorem, as it had come to be known. Unlike the partial formulations shared globally, this version contained the full implications that Joseph and Evers had once feared. A simple plaque beneath it read, "Not to own, only to learn from." "Why keep it here instead of publishing it?" asked a curious student. "Because some knowledge should be encountered in context, with full awareness of its implications," Elijah explained. "Anyone who wants to study it can do so here, understanding its history and potential impact. But it won't be weaponized or exploited." Later that afternoon, as most students explored the campus, Elijah noticed Dean Langford, now retired but still influential in academic circles, standing awkwardly near the entrance. Beside him were several Harvard faculty members, their presence at once a gesture of reconciliation and an acknowledgement of past wrongs. Elijah approached them with a measured smile. "Thank you for coming." Langford extended his hand. "What you've built here is remarkable. It's changing how we think about mathematical education at Harvard, too." He hesitated. "I want to thank you personally for holding us accountable. It wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary." Elijah nodded, accepting the gesture for what it was. Not full atonement, perhaps, but a step towards something better. As the formal opening events concluded, Elijah retreated to a quieter corner of the campus. There, on a bench beneath a young oak tree, he noticed a girl of about 11 sitting alone, intensely focused on a puzzle cube in her hands. "You look deep in thought," he said, sitting beside her. She glanced up, not recognizing him. "I'm trying to solve this math puzzle from the welcome packet, but it doesn't make sense to me." "May I see?" She handed him the paper, watching cautiously. As he examined it, rather than immediately explaining the solution, Elijah knelt beside the bench to be at her eye level. "What do you see first when you look at this?" The question seemed to surprise her. "The numbers confuse me, but I see shapes that should fit together." Elijah smiled. "That's a good way to look at it. Sometimes we get too caught up in the formulas and miss the patterns." He pointed to a section of the puzzle. "What if you try approaching it from this angle?" As they worked through the problem, together, Elijah felt a profound sense of completion. The cycle that had begun with his grandfather teaching him to see mathematics differently was continuing, not through genetic inheritance or prodigious talent, but through the simple act of creating space for different voices to be heard. Later that evening, after the crowds had departed, Elijah drove his grandfather and mother home to the modest house they now shared in a quiet neighborhood not far from the institute. "So what did you think?" he asked, as they sat together in the living room. Joseph's weathered hands trembled slightly as he sipped his tea, but his voice was steady. "I never imagined that raising questions about a government project 50 years ago would lead to this. You've built something that will outlast all of us, Elijah." Miriam reached over to squeeze her son's hand. "I'm proud of the boy you were," she said softly, "and the man you've become." The following morning, a journalist from a major education magazine caught Elijah as he arrived early at the institute. "Dr. Carter," she called, hurrying to match his stride. "Now that the institute is open, what's your next goal? A research breakthrough? Expansion to other cities?" Elijah paused, considering the question. "To make sure I'm not the last one," he answered simply. "The last what?" she pressed. "The last person whose different way of seeing things changes how we understand the world." He smiled. "My story got attention because it was unusual. I want it to become so common that it's no longer newsworthy." That evening, after the day's activities had ended, Elijah sat alone in his office. The walls were lined with mathematical texts, but also with art and music, reflections of how he continued to see mathematics as an interconnected language of patterns. From his desk drawer, he removed a fresh, leather-bound notebook, a gift from his grandfather on the institute's opening day. The first page was blank, waiting. Elijah opened his fountain pen and began to write. Not equations this time, but a letter to future students. The greatest discoveries often begin with the simplest questions. Don't be afraid to ask them even when the room falls silent, even when you're the only one raising your hand. The world changes one voice at a time, sometimes astonishingly, with the voice of a child who simply sees something others have missed. His pen continued moving across the page, the ink flowing like the mathematical patterns he had seen all his life, patterns that had led him from a Harvard lecture hall to this moment, from a hesitant question to a legacy that would echo long after his own story was complete. Outside his window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Elijah paused to watch them, distant points forming constellations, patterns waiting to be interpreted by those willing to look up and truly see. And in that moment of quiet contemplation, the boy who had changed everything understood that his journey had never really been about mathematics at all. It had been about courage, truth, and the remarkable power of a single question, asked at precisely the right moment. He returned to his writing, the white page filling with possibilities, just as it had that day long ago when a 12-year-old boy had raised his hand and the world had paused to listen. What would our world look like if we valued the brilliance of those we've been taught to ignore? If Elijah's story moved you, hit like, subscribe, and share to support more untold stories of extraordinary minds breaking barriers against all odds.